Thanks everyone for joining us for this celebration of gender spaces and gender research in GOP. So this is our first hybrid event, so it's really exciting to try out something new. So for those of you who have been with the GOP for past 2 years, you will remember that we have hosted a number of kind of talks, seminars, films, discussions. We generated brilliant friendships and feminist solidarity across the globe, which only made us aware of how precious and illuminating these encounters can be and how important it is to nurture and create spaces such as GOP. So for this special occasion, we invited a very special guest who will talk about a very specific kind of feminist space, memory. So how we can use memory to facilitate feminist solidarities, how we can use memory as a method, and I don't want to hijack her talk. So just a small housekeeping before I pass you over to Marjana. But without further ado, I'll pass you on to our feminist fellow, Marjana Johansson from Glasgow University.
Thanks, Nela. It's so great to be here. I'm so happy to be part of this GOP celebration. I've been following what GOP's been doing the past couple of years. I've been participating in some webinars, and it's always been so rewarding. So I'm really thrilled to be part of it. So thank you for the invitation. I'll be talking about as I say, my abstract personal and political project today. It's a project about researching with and from memories. It's something I've been doing with my co-author Sally Jones, who is at Manchester Met for the last 5 years or so. So I want to present the project, how it came about, and then to think about perhaps memory more broadly as well, as a social phenomenon and collective memory, and perhaps also the ethics and politics of memory, and to think about what memory can mean for feminist organizing. So let's start from this standpoint then of using our personal and cultural biographies as sources of knowledge, because this is what the project is about. In her paper from '86, Patricia Hill Collins writes about the outsider within status, and in this case of black women, who occupy marginal positions in different spaces, including academia. She speaks of sociology, and how some tap this standpoint, we know about standpoint feminism, in producing distinctive analysis of race, class, and gender. And being an outsider within provides a combination of closeness and distance, which provides the potential for new perspectives and for enriching sociological discourse. It's also a state of tension, of course, because as the outsider tries to find ways to navigate an alien environment, which sometimes can be hostile. Whatever the process is, it leaves its marks, because, as Collins says, people who become outsiders within are forever changed by their new status. They become different people. And this reflexivity offers a source of knowledge. This is probably not something that I have to sell to this audience. Feminist writing has known this for a long time. There's been an increase also in management and organization studies, in autobiographical writing, autoethnographic writing, for example, within the strand of so-called writing differently that has emerged. And the project I'll talk about has a similar starting point in the sense of being an outsider within and navigating this tension. In this case, the lived dimensions are class and gender. So it's been a joint endeavor with my co-explorer, Sally. It started from a serendipitous meeting at a conference, and we just realized that we had something in common that kind of drew us to each other. And that was the background of being the first in our families to go to university, never having had any expectations to do so, and certainly not to stay in academia. We also had different understandings of class, so we've labeled ourselves as coming from a working class background, But whilst Sally, being of a Welsh working class background, had a very clear idea of her identity, me, coming from Finland, had a much less vague grasp of class, because it's not really part of common discourse. So we decided to explore this together and explore what it's like to be working class white women in academia. And what I'll focus on here is a chapter that we published called Writing Past and Present, Classed and Gendered Selves, which has been published in an edited collection on writing differently, edited by Nancy Harding, Jenny Helin, and Alison Pullen. And this was in itself a very rewarding writing experience. Let's start with class then, because that's what's at the heart of this for us. And so I want to say something about how we approached class, because there are obviously many different ways of conceptualizing class. And reading Annette Kuhn really spoke to us. And she says that class is something beneath your clothes, under your skin, in your reflexes, in your psyche, at the very core of your being. And that means the class is a lived experience and something that's an indelible part of our being in the world. And this, to me, was very compelling. She writes about her own class journey and family relationships and how complicated they can be. And she writes in a very personal and engaging manner. And the book has family photographs and so on, so very, very rich. And much of what she writes about also resonated with us. For example, the difficulties in articulating some experiences of not quite fitting in, but also fitting in some ways. For example, being white and in a white-dominated academia. But sometimes not belonging, sometimes perhaps not quite passing, as she writes about. And it's also about finding a voice for those experiences. And it sparked our interest because she was referring to memory work. And she says this is a route to critical consciousness that embraces the heart as well as the intellect, because class is something beneath your clothes and under your skin. And this can create new understandings, memory work, of both past and present. So that spoke to us, and so we decided to take this as a starting point. What we wanted to look at was, what is it like to be a working class woman in academia? So we started from the present. Yeah, that was the puzzle we had, or the experiences that we felt that we shared. We're obviously not the first ones to write about this. People like Valerie Hay, or Vic Loveday, Diane Ray, and so on have written very eloquently about this before. We also wrote about this, and we used the concept of interloper, perhaps again a variation of the outsider within, somebody who is perhaps not always quite meant to be in this domain, brings something that might disrupt the domain, and so on. And the literature speaks a lot about class and gendered stereotypes of working class women in academia, which still is a middle class domain. Working class women perhaps not speaking correctly or being too loud, but also on the other hand working very hard and therefore being given lots of responsibilities and so on. And these are stereotypes. And we were specifically interested in these breaches. What are the moments where you just become aware of yourself in some way? And we were specifically interested in a classed way, like when there's a kind of a glitch in the matrix and you just become very self-aware. So that's where we started, and reading around this, came across this collection called Those Winter Sundays, Female Academics and Their Working Class Parents. It's an American one. And first of all, the title just spoke to me. It's actually from a poem by an American poet, Robert Hayden. And the poem is about his father getting up early in the morning, as it says, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather. And this kind of sets the tone for this collection as well. It's those who have gone on to academia and their relationship with their parents, with whom they cannot share this experience fully. And that is both, of course, it's rewarding to have these opportunities, but it's also this difficulty in that you kind of become an interloper in both places. When you go back, you don't go back to the same anymore. You might not be able to speak about your work and so on. And the whole collection is written in a very personal manner with photographs. And this kind of showed that perhaps this is the way to go about it, because it was a lot of, the whole point was them talking about their families, their background, and what happens to this relationship. And this is from one of the chapters. That's her graduating, as we can see, and that's her father, who worked as a janitor in the university where she was had a fellowship. And she writes about how they went for coffee together and how he kind of saw that, well, you have a job, that's fine, but not quite still. But they perhaps couldn't quite connect with what it is that she was doing, although there was a lot of pride in that. And this then is about exactly looking to the past to understand your present situation. And that's what we ended up doing as well, because we kind of noticed as we were doing this research that in our conversations, which we started exploring our professional circumstances, and we just noticed that to a large extent they seemed to focus on our pre-professional past. And when we started to analyze our transcripts, we wondered if we had kind of missed the mark, because if we're writing about being working class women in academia, surely we have to write about more recent professional experiences. But we had a pressing need to delve into the past, as we say in this chapter, that what we ended up doing was that we write of and for a place where we no longer live, kind of both geographically but also culturally, but which part of us will always inhabit and be inhabited by, deeply embedded in us and resides in the past, but it insistently inserts itself without warning into our current lives. And these are the kind of the breaches where something happens, almost like a time-space continuum, where something emerges that just, brings the past back in. And so we thought that, okay, but this is important. Only by thinking about the past and talking about the past can we understand what's going on in the present. So maybe we had to talk about what has happened up to the point of becoming academics, because we needed to explain both to ourselves and to each other how we had arrived here. And too often this had been a hidden part, almost like leaving behind, but now we wanted to write for this place, of the place and for the place as well. So something about a bit of a methodological discussion or some pointers, because this was the way we went about it. So Annette Kuhn writes about memory work, but it's often associated with Frigga Haug in the 80s, and specifically, as she said, developed with and for the feminist movement. And it was to do with understanding women's socialization. She has a very detailed description of it as a methodology. Collaborative, so you work with memories in groups, maybe 10 people. You pose a common question or scenario, situation. An example she gives is, when was I afraid? Everybody writes a text about that situation, whatever is relevant to them, and then there are group discussions of this experience. And that's drawing on your personal memory. And through the comparisons, you kind of discuss. It's not about therapy. It's not about perhaps coming to a resolution, but it's to understand how women are embedded in particular societal relations and power relations that kind of shape these experiences. So we come to understand these ways of construction and self-representation in the culture. So it's specifically drawing on memories. There's another, in combination with this, we decided to do a duo ethnography, which is from education, the field of education, where, as it says, well, two or more, or duo kind of, to me, indicates two, where you share, again, life histories, and that's the whole point. You bring your life history to this third space, as it says, is created, often with artifacts and photographs like we did as well. And the point is to explore differences. So it's a methodology to not just, again, coalesce around commonalities, but exploring differences and how we can understand each other's differences, the experiences and what has shaped them. So for Sally and myself, a lot we had in common. I mean, that's why we kind of bonded in the first place. We felt that we had some experiences in common about being in academia. We also had differences when it came to understandings of class due to the different backgrounds that we had. And that's what we explored. And that kind of really helped us, again, articulate for ourselves what those experiences had been. So what we did then was we had different texts that we wrote. So we wrote autobiographical texts, basically just deciding that whatever you feel is important from childhood and so on, teenage years, education, up to the present, in order to tell the other person of who we were. So we didn't know each other very well at this point, and I think that was a good thing because we needed to really explain to each other. This is an example of one of Sally's autobiographical texts. She says, my parents, especially my dad, were very open about their political affiliations and were ardent Labour supporters. My dad would get up and switch the TV off when Thatcher was on, saying he couldn't stand her voice. The reports of the miners' strike also had a major effect on me. Class was being played out in the violent suppression of picket lines, mobilising police from across the country who were sent to South Wales to deal with strikers and to get the scabs safely into work. This developed in me a burning sense of unfairness and an absolute abhorrence of perceived injustice. And this was for her a very strong formative moment. For me, it's not a lived experience, and I probably hadn't heard of, at that point in time, I wasn't aware of the miners' strike in the UK. Coming to the UK later, this is a huge part, of course, of what we might call a collective memory. And so her talking about that to me gave me insight into how political awakenings and feminist awakenings can happen, which it wasn't the same for me. We also wrote class episodes, and these were the breaches, little vignettes, and we wrote about 10 each, I think. Exactly those moments, the glitch in the matrix, where you just become aware of yourself in some kind of classed manner, and then we explored those, and this is one of mine. This is more recent. It was when I was already in academia. I was having a coffee with a colleague I'd recently started, and he asked me, oh, what do your parents do? And as I say, as always, I felt a twinge hearing that question because I expect my answer to differ from their background. So I said, oh, my mother is a cleaner and my father is retired, voluntary severance. And he cheerily said that his mother was a cleaner as well, and she was working, and he was working class. But unlike with Sally, the sense I got was not one of recognition or some form of bond, but a sense of him wearing kind of a different kind of working class badge with pride, in a, for me, unfamiliar or exaggerated manner, as I say, as if claiming to be working class gave him credentials in a different way that I couldn't access. And this is where gender enters the picture as well. I mean, there is writing about exactly this, how class, of course, is gendered, and there are different resources, different forms of capital, if you like, to draw on to present that class. So there wasn't a self-evident forging of a link either. But the twinge, this embodied sense where something stirs in you, and an uncomfortable question. Now I'm thinking, why is this an uncomfortable question? But it was then. Now I'm also thinking, well, who asks you anyway as an adult, or what do your parents do? But at that moment, I felt this, oh, I've heard this question before, and I'm not sure about I know the answer, but the answer doesn't fit in this environment, or at least that was my conception then. And we had these recorded conversations, so we met up with photographs and talked about each other's backgrounds and these vignettes and the autobiographical texts. And in one of the cases, Sally says that, oh yeah, in some ways you're staging your memories. You're having to explain because you can't assume that the other person actually understands about your history. And this idea of, I think, staging one's memories is really interesting, because that's what memory is. We tap into something for a particular purpose. So for this exercise, this project, we looked for certain types of memories. and the sharing of them does something to that memory, of course. It can gain new significance, and it certainly tells you something about your present self. And this thing that you have to explain to the other person, some things that perhaps otherwise you take for granted, and all of a sudden you see them in a new light, and that opens up new possibilities for reflexivity and constructing your own narrative, I guess. And just to show then how we did this, a geoethnography is often presented as a dialogue. This is from the chapter, we call them snapshots, some of the themes, and passing was one of them. Again, how to learn to navigate this environment or pass. This was about passing in a classed way. So we talked about, you go to university and all of a sudden it might not be that you feel intellectually inferior, but there's something going on that you quite don't know. You're not a fish in water, I guess, as maybe Bourdieu would say. And Sally was talking about passing as middle class. She didn't feel like she had to until she was actually starting to work in academia. For her, it was also passing as English. Being Welsh, she went to an English university, and so she modified her accent and all those kind of ways of being Welsh, I guess, that to avoid being classified first and foremost as that. And so we talk about this passing and various ways that it expresses itself. And it was these kinds of conversations that I think brought out and developed our sense of what it means to be of a particular class in academia and why we had those experiences. So what it brought up, well, first of all, memory isn't just an archive, a database, where you store and retrieve kind of these discrete past experiences. It's a social thing. And this is very much part of memory studies as well, that even though it's individual, so it's personal, but social, there's always a social aspect to it. And Sue Campbell, who I draw on quite a bit here, a feminist philosopher, has written about memory, talks about the present past, that the past is always in the present in some way. And sometimes we actively bring forth the present, the past into the present. But even when we're not doing that, it is there. And sometimes it makes itself known in an embodied manner, for example. So sharing memories, because she talks a lot about sharing memories and how important that is. And that kind of also reconstitutes the present self, because what this project did was kind of a renewed understanding of what having this identity is and what we can do with it. It forged a bond between us. And it also made clear this sense of how memories is linked to place, emotion, and the senses. And we know what it's like. Sometimes we hear a song or a smell, we smell something and we're instantly transported into a particular time and place. And I was reminded of this a few years back. This is from my hometown. This is where I grew up, in this low-rise building. My first 6 years of my life I spent here. And I hadn't been back for many years. And now going back, and this is like a cluster of houses owned by at least then the biggest employer in my hometown, a big company, which my dad worked for as well. So my parents were renting there when I was born. And now it's all derelict. All the houses, these are boarded up, so they have black boards over the windows. That's our kitchen window there, the ground floor to the left and the living room window to the right. And it was really poignant being there again. And it's all just gone. The playground is kind of falling apart. And how memories, of course, linked to place. And places move on. And it's just, again, it gives this jolt somehow. So to me, what this did, the project, was about kind of rewriting, not just writing past and present, classed and gendered selves, but rewriting them. It enabled the expansion of our understanding of our positions in academia, provided the means to make our presence known, kind of speaking out in a manner, and joining others who speak of these other places. You realize that there is, of course, an ongoing conversation, and you become part of something. And as we say, it's also revealed to us that whilst this meant finally speaking of and for the place we come from, which had been silenced so far, it also showed us that we had always, even though we might not have known it, kind of written from that place, any case, because the past does make itself known. So it was a very important project, I think, but even though it's in this case focused on our personal memories, memory is always social, and so I think it's good to think about memory and sociality more broadly. What does that mean then with collective memory, and how perhaps we can work with it or forge these bonds or communities and collectives. And reading Sue Campbell, she talks about relational remembering, and she says it's intimately interwoven with capacities to form relations. I mean, how many conversations do we have where they start with, oh, do you remember when? Or I remember when. And we actually had this last night, sitting around the dinner table. A lot of the conversations we had was about our past. What were the differences? What were the similarities? Again, it was about class, academia. And it's a way of getting to know each other that's a very kind of intimate, but a yet social way. So we in a way learn to remember certain things, and we learn to know what we should remember, first of all, what's important to remember in life, and how we should remember certain things. So it's a compelling way of strengthening a connection with someone we know or forging a new connection. It's one everyday aspect of Campbell's notion of relational remembering, that it's key to forming relations. And this, I think, is a good starting point for thinking about memory in a social context. Campbell says that it's one of the primary ways in which we come to know others, form relationships with them, reforming our sense of self as we come repeatedly under the influence not only of our own pasts as understood by others, but of the pasts of others as well. So it assumes this relational view of the self where we are made through others. And part of this making is sharing these memory worlds. So she uses the phenomenological language of memory worlds to discuss how memory forms a central part of how the world is constituted. And that there are different ways in which memory worlds are made. Some memory worlds are familiar, make us feel at ease, others not so much. And it's in the entering into others' memory worlds that Campbell sees political possibilities of solidarity. As she says, in entering worlds of memory in which we are not at ease, we can nevertheless engage with values, support identities, and undertake new relationships of solidarity. And I like this idea of the memory world. There are different types of memory worlds, cultural, scientific, family, different types of groups, and so on. But I think it's evocative to think of it in this phenomenological way, that it's a way of being in the world, and part of that being in the world is constituted through memory. Again, it's not confined to something, it's not locked away, and we just tap into it whenever we need to remember something. It's there in a much more compelling way. So relational remembering. And that includes collective remembering, which is, as Kuhn here says, telling stories about the past, our past, and that's a key moment in the making of ourselves. She might have meant the individual, but it can be interpreted here as a collective we as well. Collective memory, I've usually traced back to Halbwach's writing in the 1920s. It denotes shared memories of a group that are somehow meaningful and important to that group's identity. It has been questioned whether other terms, perhaps such as myth or tradition, can do the job, but it is undoubtedly an evocative term. And it also draws attention to different ways in which remembering is a collective endeavor. For example, families or groups of friends, or on a larger scale, national or transnational memory of particular events. While collective memory is seen as important for identity generation and a sense of belonging, it also, of course, does or can do the work of exclusion. Who is the collective that is remembered and doing the remembering, and who is not? What makes one a member of the collective? Whose past is the so-called our past? Campbell says that collective memory too often presupposes the notion of a group that sees events from a single committed perspective. Instead, she refers to another feminist philosopher, Maria Lugones, and calls for models for conceptualizing memory that do not reinforce the logic of community as equivalent to homogenization. And this is, I think, this really the nub of collective remembering, that in a way it's productive. I guess it can create a sense of belonging and a sense of community, but it can tip over into something more oppressive, perhaps, that seeks to erase different voices, because there are always different experiences. Even within a so-called community, there will be different perspectives and different experiences that mean that there isn't a complete homogenized understanding of what this collective is about. And one key way through which this collective memory is built is through commemoration, acts and material artifacts that represent some past event. Through commemoration, a version of events is established as the official one. Remembering is imbued with power. It can be a site of contestation, however, through what Campbell calls performing oppositional memory, bringing to the fore experiences and memories that differ from the established canon. And these serve an important purpose for disrupting dominant memory worlds, if you say that. There's a paper by Leanne Kutcher and Karen Dale and Melissa Tyler. They write about the politics of commemoration in organizations and outside, and how commemoration can support traditionalist purposes, but also make visible the stigmatized and the marginalized. I've taken this photo from their article. It's the Beacon of Hope Memorial Garden in Manchester, the Sackville Memorial Gardens in Manchester. It's a memorial to those who have lost their lives to AIDS, and it's a symbol of solidarity for those living with HIV today. And this, to me, can be linked to Campbell's notion of oppositional memory, a resistance to dominant narratives and a claiming of space, both materially and symbolically. And in this paper, they frame this as a politics of recognition, again, of what is legible, what is acceptable, what can be memorialized, and that is a political process of recognition. So again, and I guess we know this, memory isn't this just getting all the facts together. It's very selective, including collective remembering, where specifically the purpose is identity building as well, which can be a very strong driving force for preserving a particular type of past and a particular type of community. I mean, here in the UK, coming here, one of the things that Remembrance Day in November is a big thing, and there is the idea of lest we forget, like we must never forget this. Apparently that is from a Kipling poem, which has its own associations, but it's like, well, who is we, first of all, that mustn't forget, and what is it that we mustn't forget? And the imagery to me that goes with this is of a very particular kind, of the heroicism and so on. But if you, for example, read the war poets, you get a very different visceral remembering of the war and its realities. And then there's this whole debate often about, the wearing of the poppy and so on. And that's when this collective remembering takes on a particular tone. If we talk about remembering, there's always also forgetting. That's the other part of remembering. So remembering implies forgetting, and similarly to the notion of ignorance, we perhaps tend to think about at least some forms of forgetting as simply slipping away from memory, not being recalled because something has lost its meaning, or it was never that important to begin with. Forgetting, however, can also be intentional and is political. When we deem particular events or people worthy of remembering, others are deemed better forgotten. And here Campbell writes about the treatment by the church and state of the First Nations people in her home country, Canada. And we, of course, have many other examples of the systematic erasing of some from the official collective memory of a nation and from memorialization. This picture actually has to do with attempting to bring back into dominant collective memory, so an oppositional remembering, the fates of the First Nations children who were taken away from their homes and put in so-called residential schools for assimilation, which were established in the 19th century and onwards, and many of them never returned. And a couple of years ago, 2021, news surfaced of a mass grave in one of these residential schools, and others have been uncovered, and so on. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been set up, and a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation was instigated. So this is an attempt of bringing back something into the dominant narrative of collective memory, because of course in some groups this has never gone away. It doesn't mean that it's completely forgotten. It's again this, like, what counts as the official memory of, in this case, a nation. And those are perhaps debates that increasingly have surfaced, and the idea that, again, the past is in the present. It is still there, and for some people very viscerally so. So this forgetting is a way of discrediting certain memories and certain ways of remembering and claiming authority over the past. And this is what memory does. So therefore, social, but also political. So moving towards the end then, saying something about organizing with and by memory, because we've already seen that memory is both organized, how we remember, what we remember, with who we share what we remember, that's already organized in a way. And it's also organizing. What gets retold, what gets remembered, what gets forgotten, organizes the present. So what can we say then about memory for organizing and feminist solidarities? This is an image of a protest sign that it's almost become a meme, because there's lots of them. You see lots of images of these, and they turn up in many places. This is from the Women's March in London. I can't believe we still have to protest this shit. So it's a kind of humorous, but also clear reminder of the struggles that continue through time. It's a reminder that others have been there before, and so it takes the mind to the past and how the past is present in current protest. I've borrowed the title of this slide, Formations of Feminism, is from a text by Lynn Segal, where she writes about feminist memoirs as a way of getting to know past lived experience, some more personal than others. And she writes, where and when women record lives of dissent and struggle, whether focusing on their own feelings or not, private lives throw fresh light on the ways in which we are defined by and help to define the worlds we move through. Memoirs convey lived experiences precisely through memory, which brings the past to the present. And as Segal says, help to define the worlds we move through today. I've also borrowed here from Vicky Turbine. She writes about her own, journey of feminist genealogy, her journey to becoming a feminist in academia, and then left academia, because that in her showed something that she realized that she didn't want to live with. And she emphasizes how intergenerational learning, as she says, can make us implicitly feminist before we learn the formal language of feminism. Memories of her mother's situation as a single mother form an important part of her engagement with feminist thought. And she says that we often learn our politics through intergenerational dialogue. And this dialogue, I think, can be carried out in various ways, either through exchanging of lived experience but also through this recording of experiences, through memoirs, for example. That's also a way in which we can engage in this intergenerational dialogue. The significance of our own and others' memories and past struggles in the present can perhaps be captured in, and this is now only a couple of days ago, I saw this as I was zooming in to a defense in Finland by Anna-Liisa Kaasila-Pakanen, who writes about encounters, and she draws on post-colonial literature. And she speaks of space-time of solidarity, which denotes how practices of solidarity enacted in specific places and times in history become shared, reactivated, and thought anew in present-day encounters between people. And this space-time of solidarity can perhaps be conceived of as entering, again, these different memory worlds. And although we might not find exactly the same experience, we might find a joint political aim and therefore solidarity. So this really brings memory to me to the fore, in that the solidarity is also built not only across space but across time. Drawing to a close, and perhaps with the risk of sounding a bit cliched or cheesy, I wanted to end with this words from Rebecca Solnit from Hope in the Dark, where she says that the branches are hope, the roots are memory. Hope is a driving force for action. It's not a passive sitting back and hoping for the best. And for Solnit, it's memory that provides the fuel for action as the grounds for hope. The grounds for hope lie in the records and recollections of the past. She says that things don't always change for the better, but they can change, and we can play a role in that change. And this is where hope comes in, and memory. And that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for this wonderful and inspiring talk. I really, really enjoyed that. And of course, you're not only a gender academic, you're also a kind of gender activist as well. You know, you're a committed feminist, and I'm not only referring to your work of shaping thought, globally in gender research through your role as associate editor. I'm talking about the kind of agentic power of your research. And I know you touched upon this already in your presentation, but I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on this political subjectivity that this engaging with memory afforded you and Sally, and maybe others. So you talk more about it as a method, but I'm more concerned now also about content. Like, what this work led you to in terms of political subjectivity?
Well, first of all, I think it enabled us to articulate something that we hadn't been able to put words to. And also something that was sometimes shrouded in shame, almost, and therefore hidden, and feeling like it becomes very individualized. So the reason I have these feelings, it's because I need to change something, I need to learn something, I need to be different. And what this enabled us to understand was that it might come across as individualized, but it's actually systemic and social. And it really helped articulate that, being part of this the social structures and a particular system that kind of engenders these feelings. And once you know that, then you know how to deconstruct that or dismantle that or resist it or make it something different. And I think that was a really important part of this, which wasn't clear from the beginning. It was more about, well, let's share these memories and let's tell others of what we have experienced. But actually, it brought something much more than that. And I've noticed also that it provides a a joint platform for others, because there had been other meetings then where people say that, oh, I have had those experiences as well. And once you talk about it, you realize that, oh, this is a shared experience. So why does it remain hidden sometimes, or maybe too often? And that's what it showed. It brings something into light and it articulates something. And that means you can then do something with it.
That's really, really powerful because, as you said yourself in your talk, these memories or these experiences may be different, but there is something in common there that brings you closer together, where you kind of realize that you are part of a collective rather than
and you're part of the system. So Sally, for example, remembered the time when she applied to go to university. This was never something that, her parents, nobody had expectations, but she did well in school, so she decided to apply for university, and she went to this in England, went to this interview to study literature, completely unprepared. She thought they were going to talk about, oh, why do you want to study here, and so on, and she said they talked about whatever, Shakespeare, whatever it was, and she was completely unprepared, bombed, and as she said, got back on the train and went back to Wales. And and at that moment, she just felt embarrassment, like she didn't know how to be, she didn't understand the answers. And of course, what we then can discuss is that, well, the education she went through, the background, they never set her up for this. There was no training for this, and this is not an individualized problem. You're already part of something. And she entered into this completely alien world, and at that point she thought, okay, well, this is not for me. And so she decided to apply to a polytechnic, these post-92s, because apparently that's more for me. University isn't for me.
Because polytechnic is for working class girls.
Yes. And that's one of those moments where it's kind of made clear to you, and you see it as your perhaps personal failure, which it isn't, because maybe you didn't have a chance in the first place to master if you don't know the rules of the game.
Yeah. Obviously, you're more than welcome to ask your own questions, although I have a few, and we probably have more.
I'm waiting for the chat to come to life.
But I'm also wondering about, going back even further, in terms of kind of memories that we want to access, memories that shape our feminist agency or political subjectivity. So can you maybe talk us through some of your early influences, through, forging solidarity through time, through things that you have read or experiences that you had? You presented that very evocative, poignant picture of passing through the space where you used to live, and how it kind of became decrepit over time, devoid of life. So can you, maybe talk about that kind of shaping of your feminist political agency through time?
I would say that the articulation came quite late. As Vicky Turbine talks about, that there might be an implicit understanding of something and of kind of feminist principles, but again, you don't have the tools to articulate that. So it wasn't until I was doing my PhD, which wasn't a feminist project, but that's when I came across a group, in this case, in Helsinki at Hanken, where I was, and that finally gave form to these ideas and thoughts that I had before, but which were more of this intuitive thinking of, I don't know, something's not right here, or I don't quite fit. I felt, for example, early on that I didn't quite fit certain ideas of, I don't know, girliness or femininity, however we see that wasn't quite for me, and feeling a bit clumsy and not with it, and something was going on there, which meant that I somehow didn't slot into, which others seem to do with ease, into these preconceived ideas. And so something was going on there, but it was just this sense of, I don't know what's going on here. And finally then, being in academia and doing my PhD, understanding that, okay, this is how I can put words to this. This is what's going on here. Because it wasn't part of my education system until then. I studied business and management, and that definitely wasn't part of the curriculum, and so on. So this awakening was implicit before finally being articulated.
Yeah, so it was experiential
Yeah,
rather
very
than
much so. And
not fitting in.
yeah, this embodied idea, or embodied sense again that something is going on.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, and speaking of embodiment, then that embodied side of memory is also something that you touched upon. So it's not this, you said, it's not this pool of facts that you are tapping in and out.
No.
It's quite embodied and visceral. So what did you know, what are those kind of moments, nodal points in your kind of formation as a feminist that were important to you then? Which were the moments that you thought, well, these are kind of significant to my political agency?
I think it was sometimes in gendered relations, like already being a teenager, and group formations, and what was expected of girls, what was expected of boys, and why is it that some have, in a way, power over others, and some are trying to live up to expectations or be formed according to particular norms. And I think, I don't know if there was I don't think there's been an epiphany as such, but it's an accumulation of small incidences, and growing up, for example, harassment, and how normalized it is, and how it's, oh, well, that's just the way life is, you know. As you're being commented on, as you're being sometimes physically touched, some people take the right to be in your personal space and to comment on you and so on, and how that is somehow normalized, and oh, well, we just need to live with it. And it's that's accumulation, and realizing how common it is, and thinking that, well, it isn't right, though. It's not just the way things are. And it's that, yeah, as I say, accumulation of those moments.
Yeah. So it's mostly injustices then, mostly unpleasant memories and those moments of injustices that kind of graduated you to a protest.
I guess so, yeah, a consolidation of something. And I would say that this sense of injustice is important, because that's also very embodied. When you feel that something isn't right, and then you can theorize that, so you can intellectualize it, but it's this the feeling of it that really sets something in motion. And memories are like that, and we know that there are, of course, also more traumatic memories that kind of make themselves known. So there's always linked to emotion, and I guess that's why we remember certain things and we don't remember other things. Is the way they are linked to emotions, for example.
Yeah, yes, and this is why it is important to talk about it, I suppose, because my kind of memories of working class and working class activism were largely positive, but that's because of that geographical context that I come from. So there are all these kind of different understanding of class experience that all matter, I suppose, for feminist experience. So we have a question there from Amna.
Thank you for your talk. So my question is, like, how do we conceptualize class? Because class positions can shift throughout our lifetime. And at times our present can inform our past. Our present class positions can influence how we see our past. For instance, I was born in Pakistan, and I was born in a middle class family. And when I moved to the UK in 2019, my class position shifted to quite precarious, living on a stipend. And most of the things which I probably never thought about, they were significant back in the past, they suddenly gained so much importance. Like, I used to look at my past, like my initial years, with a sense of nostalgia. And I just felt like they became really significant. They became memories somewhere for me. So I just wonder how our current positions within the sectors we are working in, they inform equally how we see things backward. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this idea of how we conceptualize class. And so I picked out that definition about class being part of your psyche and under your skin and so on, because there are different ways in which we can understand what class is. More from an occupational position. Exactly this, like, what is the parental occupational background? So more of this structural or a more lived experience position. And when we look into lived experience, like exactly this gliding between worlds, where you come from a particular class position, then through moving, sometimes it can be geographically or social mobility, and you move into a different classed world. And the question is, what am I now? And that's part of what we grapple with as well. So does this mean, because now being an academic, having the luxury of being on a full-time permanent contract, you have many of the accoutrements of being middle class. Can you really claim then that, well, actually I'm not middle class? And there is this tension between that. So there are certain sometimes external indicators that are given that are said that, well, this puts you in a certain class position. That doesn't have to map onto your sense of class, though. And this was what Beverly Skeggs, for example, talks about, this lived experience of class. And sometimes, I guess we feel like we're being shifted into something that we don't have control over ourselves. Being put in a particular class position where we don't necessarily feel at home. What you say about nostalgia, I think is really interesting. Like, what do we need that nostalgia for? What is it that you draw on? What is it that that source gives you? Is it a sense of belonging in the now as well, or is it a sense of loss? For example, loss is something that we talk about, that social mobility is seen as a positive thing. That's what you should strive for in society, but it can also be a sense of loss for something that has been, and which is an important part of you, and now is much more difficult perhaps to hold on to or to embrace in the same way that we've done before. So I think that's a really good example of this shifting of those positions. Yeah.
So we have a question from Owen and then from Saoirse.
I'm actually going to change my question because I don't want to be the person who changes the subject, so maybe we can build on the class thing a bit more, but I'm going to improvise slightly. So I guess what I saw coming through quite clearly there was that tension that probably none of us can solve, but maybe it's a helpful tension between that, I guess, properly Marxist account of classes. You're forced to sell your labour to survive, basically, and then this class that you beautifully described as living under your skin that you can't quite get rid of. And I started thinking about the political implications of both of those takes on class, really, because you can speak to people not very far away from where we are right now, who would think of themselves as working class, even though they'd be retired, own their own home, be relatively well off. Often some of them are small scale buy-to-let landlords, that kind of thing, but would still think of themselves as working class, but kind of use that position in order to push quite a regressive politics and economy, basically. But equally, I guess I could think that inhabiting that sense of class from memory could be thought of differently in a more progressive way. I wondered if you'd thought about that kind of tension and the uses to which it could be put to, I guess, politically or in terms of organising.
Yeah. As you said, there are these different conceptualizations of class, and the big divide is between, for example, class as exploitation and labor relations and selling your labor and so on, which brings forward the structural aspects of it, and it's very antagonistic, that there are particular set class interests that are in conflict, and that already gives you a political landscape to work with. But it's also been, for those who advocate the lived experiences of class, that it takes away this individual experience of it. And I guess in some conceptualizations of exploitation, there's a very almost perhaps caricatured idea of the laborer and who is it is who sells their labor. And there's of course feminist writings on what counts as work and so on, reproductive labor. But this kind of erasing of that, we must understand also the individual experiences. I think both have their merits, because class is also social and structural, and we need to see those structures. But to understand the lived experience can also give us insight into, I think, what's politically possible, and also instigating change. So, yeah, to me, both those perspectives are important, and they both have their merits, and they bring out different things. But they can both be, I think, politically powerful in some way. Does that answer it, or?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah,
It's like not an either or, but hey, it's both and.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have to, all of us have to sell our labor for wages. So there's a commonality, even though we would consider ourselves working class, middle class. But, as Amna said, sometimes we are brought in these positions of precarity, and we know the casualization of labor in academia is very prevalent now, and so on. So we have a question from Saoirse, and then from Charles. Sorry, from Carl.
Yep, sorry, I've got an online question which I'm going to pose after Saoirse's asked theirs, and then we'll go to Charles.
Hi, just on class first. I'm underclass, which is something that's generally not understood in the United States when they struggle with any idea of class. But I'm also of an age where I was at university when we went through the first miners' strike. And it's intriguing that the present fascist government is intent on taking us back into a class war that was endemic in the 1980s. That's not my question. It's just a bit of background. My question is, I really want to thank you for my reading of what you're doing, which might be completely off, it might be completely left field and not what you're trying to do at all. But I have an ongoing problem with a lot of autoethnography, because they seem to try and deal with memory as a collection of artifacts from the past, which they use for truth and reconciliation to such the present. And they're always after a resolution, they're always after a therapeutic effect of closure and so on. You were talking about the relationality, and from that the phenomenological aspect, and I was struck by how that resonates, I think, with Levinas when he was talking about us as other to ourselves, and it means that we understand ourselves through memory, but also that those memories make us other to ourselves and open up a future which we orientate towards, which Sarah Ahmad talks about. And I guess what I like about your work is it's orientating as an openness, but in relation to how the past is always present to help orientate ourselves, and how we need to use the past to do that orientation, but not to close.
No.
I struggle with the idea of truth and reconciliation. It was used in Spain to try and close off the Civil War. You might find Salazar's book, Soldiers of Salamis, really quite interesting, because he talks about how his past is disinterred and how memories orientate ourselves and so on. And I think it's really quite powerful for autoethnography to orientate towards the future and to stop trying to find therapeutic reasons to close the past. But it's kind of more of a point, less of a question.
One of those. Thank you so much. I think it is a very important point. And it's not about, as you say, the therapeutic closing of the past or to kind of moving on. There's all these truth and reconciliation committees and so on. If the aim is to, we'll go through it so that we can, as you say, close it and move on, that's not the point, I think. A therapeutic process is something else to collective memory and commemoration. And it's exactly this avoidance of the, I think, homogenization and agreement that this is what happened, and now we can move on. You need to keep that openness to it, and I think live with it, because when in the collective memory, when something moves over into, you cannot in a way contest it. So memory and history, there's that whole thing about, well, what's memory and what's history? And when memory becomes kind of uncontestable or cannot be subject to scrutiny, that's when it kind of turns into myth, as some authors would say, and that's different. So there has to be this openness to contestation, these oppositional rememberings, I think that Campbell writes about. And it's ongoing. It is ongoing work. And so the future orientation is really important as well, because that takes the timeline from kind of past, present, future, although it isn't that linear either. Well, because what this memory studies and working with memory really shows is that it interacts. The past and the present interact. And Karen Barad, in one of her papers, writes about how different times, I think, bleed into one another, which is a really compelling way of seeing it, that there is this seepage between these events and times. And that means that also there isn't necessarily a closing off. Some might find a therapeutic closure, but that's not necessarily the task of memory work to reach that point, but rather to exactly keep this open to contestation and to keep it open to what other voices might be heard in this ongoing work. So I think that is an important point, that it's not about sealing something into a given meaning, but rather to keep that ambiguity and sometimes conflict. There's always contestation of events and what they mean and their significance. And that's exactly what we do in the present, because we give significance to the present as well through working with the past. And it gives us the way of thinking about, okay, so what's my responsibility now? What is our responsibility based on these past events? Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you guys. Bianca Grifani online says, thank you for that wonderful reflection, Saoirse. And there's a lot of love in the chat for you as well. Dr. Johansson, I just thought I'd mention that. So Carlos Acevedo, who is online, has asked, he says, super interesting presentation, Marjana. You mentioned Maria Lugonis. Are there any other decolonial or post-colonial feminists who've influenced your work? And if so, how?
So recently, and this is quite new to me, and it's actually thanks to some other co-authors like Rajne Limki and Mrinalini Greedharry, and we've read Quijano. That was fairly recent, and for me kind of a new acquaintance. So that has opened up to me, really thinking about again the past and how it continues, how coloniality continues to shape the present in ways that, for me, hadn't been evident, but now has opened up new avenues as well. And that's something, of course, that has a lot to do with, which isn't so much part of this work, but I think is a really important dimension of doing that.
Yeah,
I think that's ongoing work as well. So thank you for that question.
Lovely, thank you.
I think we have a question from Charles. And then I think I have one question.
Thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. I have a basic question about the identity of being working class, or in other words, the mainstream identity of being poor in societies in general, because in some places people talk rather about a popular identity. So, for example, if you think about the importance of the identity of being a farmer or a peasant, so I'm thinking, of course, about the classical conceptualizations of Gramsci, right, who thinks about the popular identity of poor people in Italy, which are predominantly the one of being a peasant from the south, and then they go to the north to become workers and so on and so forth. So there is a theoretical side about that. How do you see the link between being working class, being poor, and so on, or and what does it mean in terms of identity? And perhaps more about your work. Did this play a role in your interaction with your co-author and so on? Was this different, I don't know, in Finland and in the UK? Because I can see how, I might be wrong, but I can see how in the UK a working class identity is extremely important, in particular if you come from a Welsh community, of course, because of mining and so on and so forth. So thank you again.
Thank you. There was definitely that was part of the project, was this difference in understanding class. And I have actually, talking about twinges, I still feel a twinge as well when I present this as, we are working class women in academia. Because that to me, that label doesn't necessarily sit naturally. We are very different, as I said. Sally, very clearly, I'm Welsh, working class. This is a huge part of my identity. It tells me where I come from, who I am, and so on. For me, class wasn't part of identity formation. It wasn't part of understanding myself or others, because it wasn't part of the cultural discourse in Finland, and so you don't understand yourself in a classed manner. And this was, speaking of the kind of rural, but part of why I find this self-labeling always, I feel that identity doesn't quite sit, is that on my father's side, it's coming from farming. But that means that my grandparents, for example, owned their own little farm. So, they owned land. Well, what does that mean then? Here, land owning, how does that relate to class and so on? And because it wasn't typically working class, which is often thought of still as manual labor or a very particular way of being. So with me, it didn't quite sit either. Coming from a rural background, and this is what we worked through as well. That there are, these different understandings of class, depending on the societal context, and that's part of, I think, this articulation of what it might. I mean, whenever we label something, we put something under a blanket and try to deal with. And for analytical purposes, we need to do that sometimes. But it's important to tease out these differences. What that means as well, and that precisely has been part of this project.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, I do have one. I will abuse my chairing privileges a little bit. Unfortunately, this is for you. This is quite a big question, so a bit unfair, really. But we were talking. You were talking about memory is a live thing, as a process, and contestation as a kind of remedy to homogenizing truth or setting a particular version of truth in stone. But I was wondering, what is then an answer, a practical answer to this? Often we see the misuse of postmodern or post-structuralist thought, in media. So, what is the remedy for avoiding everything goes kind of approach? Every memory is a valid memory. Every interpretation is valid interpretation. How we can counter that kind of diametrically opposed kind of problem to homogenizing the truth.
And so in homogenizing the truth, as in claiming that there is a particular
version of truth.
Which we see, of course.
And then on an extreme spectrum, you have but there's myriad of truths. There, everything goes, everything's valid, and everything is kind of equal in value. Like every memory is equally valuable. So how we can, because I'm not sure that I buy into it, especially in the rise, in the face of right-wing movements and, political platforms that they keep having. So how can we counter that?
Yeah, well, I guess that already in remembering, it shows that, well, not all memories are equal, so to speak. There's always some kind of social agreement or social struggle around what memories emerge after all as becoming more dominant or more meaningful. And you're right, there are these different, do we call them memories then, or different, or maybe versions of the truth? Because memory and truth are also a difficult relationship.
Memory
right?
and history.
Yeah, and memory and history, exactly, which overlap, and memory can inform history. And yet there's this idea that I guess history, in a way, also needs to be more detached, that it can be detached from personal memory and lived experience. But there is a whole debate around this, how memory informs history and the accuracy. Because we know that memory, in a way, is unreliable, like personal memories are unreliable. But there are certain events that we can piece together as more or less accurate because there are different memories and different stories of that event. So I think that there's always a contestation. And of course, some claims to truth through memory are quite unfounded, I think. And I guess that's also part of the work to think about that what... not everything goes.
Yeah.
But there is an organizing in that.
That's a really thoughtful answer to a very unfair question. We have another question from Saoirse.
Sorry, it's not a question, it's a common term. There's a connection between race and class, which I think is from Ruth Gilmore, where she made the comment that prior to around about the 18th century in Europe, the poor were seen as a completely different race. And the US have almost inverted that to the idea that if you were BAME, particularly in America, you were seen as a completely different race. So it's the inversion of class with race across the years, but it's just a comment.
Yeah, important point. Yeah.
I was also thinking, if I can abuse my sort of chair position, sitting on the stage, coming from what you were just saying, Nella, and kind of underpinning, I think, the tone of a lot of the questions, is how memory and memorialising are really important in correcting particular versions of the truth. I just keep thinking of things like the Hillsborough tragedy and how important not just memory but memorialising and doing justice to the people who lost their lives that day and people who've lost their lives more recently as direct result of the tragedy. So again, this is more of a point than a question. I liked your idea of the way that if things get pieced together through different people's accounts, then we might regard them as more artifactually valuable, if you like. But I think when we're thinking about things like Hillsborough, that's such a power flip. But they had... Oh, sorry, I thought that was me for a second. Those, the families of the 92, now 93, that's not even right, is it? Thank you. I knew I'd got the number wrong, 94.
I was going to say 96.
Yeah.
There you go. Memory.
I've had to work so hard to flip that narrative, and they worked for years and years and years. In fact, I think by the time the latest verdict had gone through, one of the chief protagonists amongst the family had actually died because so much time had passed, and she'd contracted terminal cancer. So, sorry, that's a ramble. Yeah. But yeah, just some interesting stuff there, I think.
Yeah, and as you say about justice, being brought to justice, and that what happened then, and this is, of course, this is quite recent, a recent event, and has very still strong reverberations because those people are still going through it and still living with it. And it's exactly this idea of of justice, and how hard sometimes it is to reach that point, because there's a taking over of the narrative.
Yes.
That was there from the start,
Yeah.
through the media, the police, so you're already in a certain position of authority. You have a claim to truth, that what your narrative that you're presenting, that's the true one. And so there is this, all the hard work that has been going on, and it really shows this, the sociality of it, and power of determining what the narrative is, and then the effects that has on people.
My memory's just kicked in, and you're absolutely right. It is 96, but
it
I
96?
think more recently 97, because one of the folk who was very badly injured in April 89 died fairly recently, so I think it's now 97. I feel like I should get that number right. Yep.
Yeah, Grenfell.
Yep. Absolutely.
We have another question from Owain here.
Yeah, a quick one about hope, which you brought up, and contingency. So I've heard it said that the root of hope lies in drawing to the surface the potential contingencies of the past through memory. Things could have been otherwise and whatever, and that's always harder to see. Maybe actually if you want to parcel, it's not helpful to parcel things out, but from a strictly class perspective, it can have maybe a counterproductive effect. The memory is always of a series of defeats and a weakening of position. So I'm wondering if actually from a gender or feminist perspective, if there is something to be said for something different to be said about contingency and hope, and what that can tell us for organising in the present.
So looking to the past for hope, because as Solnit says, again, it's about thinking about what past it is that you're looking to, first of all. As you say, there can be a series of defeats. And yet, as she says, that might not be the whole story of the past. And we can look for those, the moments or the, whatever the cracks in that narrative of defeat after defeat. So we must think about what kind of past it is that we mobilize to start with, to work with hope. And the idea that she says also, it's called hope in the dark, and we tend to think of dark as well, there's no hope, it's hopeless, it's bleak. But dark can also mean that it's unknown to us at the moment, but precisely hope is that you still take that step into the dark. And the way you can do it is that there is a path that shows that change is possible, even though that change might not always have been for the better, but you can point to things that have perhaps changed for the better, and that can give you an impetus to work towards the future. And I know it's sometimes, I think, easy to become hopeless, to say that, well, this has been an ongoing narrative of oppression or defeat. And I think perhaps sometimes we must look for those oppositional narratives of the past as well, to not lose that faith. But it's hard. It's harder. Hope is harder work than kind of being defeatist and thinking that, well, nothing is possible. And that's also a particular political interest for some, for people to not have hope, because that means that you're not working for change. So that in itself might be also a kind of induced way of being, of keeping people in the state of hopelessness, because that keeps you in place, so to speak. So I think that's when we look to the past in order to fuel the future and hope, we think we need to think about what kind of past it is that we're looking to, and not all rosy either. The good old days and so on.
So we have a time for either one or two very brief questions. So maybe Caroline first, and then Saoirse.
So much for your presentation. Made me think about an awful lot of things, but as Alan Bennett says, history is just one bleeding thing after another. But what strikes me is we're pretty much told what to forget and what to remember.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what is really interesting right now is through the strikes that are going on at the moment, and in particular Mick Lynch, is having to recover memories from a lost generation who don't know what it is to strike, or that some of our rights are enshrined in, you know, declarations, etc. And I think that's, you know, that's really illuminating because amnesia means it's not spoken of like COVID. Don't mention COVID now, it's gone away, don't mention Brexit. This collective amnesia is very, very convenient. And so lost memories are so important, I think. It's just, yeah, thanks so much for a very provocative talk.
Yeah, you're right there, and that amnesia can be manufactured. Like ignorance can be manufactured. Sometimes we think of ignorance that, oh, it's just a gap in my knowledge. But that gap can be there for a particular reason. It is manufactured. The same thing is with amnesia. It'll be really interesting to see, I think, what comes of COVID and the way COVID and the victims of COVID, if and how that's memorialized or becomes part of the collective memory. Because now it seems to be moving towards very much business as usual. And I wonder if, because this kind of, the different events bleeding into one another, one thing I've been reading around with COVID was the Spanish flu. Because, of course, that was being referred to a lot and people started reading, the plague and so on. So, of course, it evoked something. But there wasn't a very strong link between the Spanish flu and COVID, this continuity between pandemics have been here before. And this is another instance of something that has been in the past. There's a disconnect between that pandemic and this one. And that's an interesting question. Like, why didn't that because millions died, but it didn't in a way stay. I guess this might vary across location as well, stay a strong part of the collective memory or history. And therefore the COVID now becomes a separate event almost in itself, that there's been the forgetting of it. So it'll be interesting to see what meaning is given to this event now in the end, and who's being remembered in what way. So as you say, this the amnesia and the forgetting of certain histories or memories is, I think, interesting to look into. That why is that the case? How is that manufactured? The forgetting as well as remembering. So forgetting as well as remembering.
Unfortunately, this is all the time we have for this session. Thank you so much, Marjana, for this wonderful talk. Thank you, everyone, for your inspiring questions, and to our audience online. For those of you here, we can continue these discussions in CMR, in another room. For those of you watching us online, please come tomorrow as well. At the same time, we will have our wonderful PhD students presenting their research on gender, of course. Marjana, thank you so much for coming and celebrating with us.
Thanks very much.